Mrs. Aldine Forres had worked the Varon estate kitchen for 28 years, and in that time she had learned to read people the way she read dough, by touch and by temperature, not by what they told her. She had seen good staff and bad staff, brave staff and frightened staff, and she had learned that the ones worth keeping were the ones who showed you something true in the first week, before they thought anyone was watching. The new morning cook arrived on a Tuesday in early March. Her name was Miriam. She came with 3 letters of reference, a clean knife roll, and a manner that reminded Mrs. Forres of someone who had learned to take up as little room as possible and had decided to make a virtue of it. She was perhaps mid-30s, dark-haired, with the kind of face that was not beautiful in any calculated way, but that you found yourself looking at twice. Warm brown eyes, a steady mouth, the look of a woman who had thought hard things through and arrived somewhere quieter on the other side. She wore long sleeves rolled to just below the elbow, even on the warmest mornings when the ovens had been going since 5. Mrs. Forres noticed this on the first day and said nothing about it. She had learned when to notice and when to keep her counsel. What she noticed first in the professional sense was that Miriam was good, very good. Her laminated dough was patient and even, her custards did not break. She timed the ovens by instinct and the instinct was sound. The kitchen liked her within a day, which was not always how it went. Young Petra, the second pastry hand, had been skittish and quiet since the difficult winter, and Miriam drew her out without appearing to try, asking her questions about the estate's preferences, remembering the answers, passing small tasks her way as if Petra had been waiting to be asked. The under-butler, Mr. Thorne, who was exacting about the breakfast presentation and made his displeasure known in full, offered Miriam no complaint after the second morning. This was, in Mrs. Forres's experience, the equivalent of a standing ovation. So the kitchen settled around Miriam the way a kitchen settles around competence, quickly and without ceremony. What Mrs. Forres was slower to name was the other thing. It happened on the 3rd morning. The copper stockpot, the large one, the old one that had been on the estate since before Mrs. Forres herself arrived, slipped from young Petra's grip as she lifted it from the high shelf and fell onto the stone flags with a sound like a cannon. Every person in the kitchen flinched. Petra gasped and apologized and turned pink. The 2 Sue's hands swore under their breath and then apologized for swearing. Mrs. Forres pressed a hand to her sternum and breathed. Miriam went still. Not the flinch and recover that everyone else showed, not the hand to the heart, the startled laugh, the nervous joke. She simply stopped, her hands flat on the bench, her eyes going somewhere that was not the kitchen, and for 4 seconds she was not present in any way that Mrs. Forres could describe. Then she came back. She bent to help Petra retrieve the pot. She said something quiet and kind to the girl. She went back to her pastry. Mrs. Forres watched this and filed it in the part of herself that kept the things she did not yet understand. The second morning, he had appeared at the kitchen pass. This also was unusual. Cale Varon ran a loyalty-based organization whose reach Mrs. Forres understood only in outline. She did not ask and was not told, and what was vague background remained vague background, which was how it had always been and how she preferred it. What she knew of the man, from 28 years of proximity, was this. He was compact and private and said very little, and the rooms of the estate arranged themselves around his presence the way iron filings arrange themselves around a pole. She had never heard him raise his voice. She had seen men twice his size go quiet when he entered. His staff did not fear him in the way you fear someone cruel. They feared him in the way you fear letting down someone whose respect you would not willingly lose. He asked a great deal by asking almost nothing. He did not come to the kitchen, not as a habit, not without reason. He had come the second morning and stood at the pass, not inspecting, not speaking, and looked at the kitchen in the particular way he had of looking, which was the way a man looks at something he is deciding about. His eyes moved across the station, across Petra, across the 2 Sue's hands, and rested for a moment on Miriam's back as she worked. Then he was gone. He came again on the 3rd morning, same stillness, same duration, gone before Mrs. Forres could form a sentence. She did not mention it to Miriam. She thought about it in the hour before dawn on the fourth morning, turning it over, and she arrived at something she chose not to examine too directly. On the fourth morning he came in. Not to the pass, through the door, into the kitchen proper at 7 in the morning when the day staff were at full tilt, and the smell of butter pastry and the first tranche of coffee had thickened the warm air. He walked with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who did not need to announce himself, because no announcement was ever required. The kitchen noticed him the way a field notices weather, a slight shift, a recalibration, eyes finding reasons to look at the worktops. Mrs. Forres stood straighter without meaning to. He crossed to Miriam's station. She was working the second laminate, her back partly to the door, her attention on the bench, and did not see him approach. When she became aware of him beside her she turned, and her hands stilled on the dough, and she looked at him with no particular alarm, which was itself a thing Mrs. Forres noted. Miriam was not afraid of him. She was not performing the absence of fear the way some people performed it. She simply did not have it, or had set it down somewhere prior to arriving, in a manner that was its own kind of history. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set a card face down on the bench beside her workstation. A plain card, no name on the back. Mrs. Forres would see later, only a number. "In case you need it," he said. 4 words quiet, no inflection to interpret. He turned to go. Miriam looked at the card, she picked it up, she read the number. "I already know it," she said. He stopped. The kitchen had not precisely stopped. The ovens ran. The coffee dripped. Petra continued setting plates with great and deliberate concentration. But the room had contracted around those 4 words the way a room contracts around the thing that matters most in it. He turned back. He looked at her, and the look was not the deciding look from the past, not the assessing distance he wore in the rooms of his life. It was something Mrs. Forres had not seen on his face in 28 years of proximity, and she did not have a precise word for it, but if she had reached for one she might have said, relief. The particular relief of a man who has been carrying a weight alone and has just understood that he did not need to. "Who gave it to you?" he asked. Miriam set the card down on the bench beside the dough. She did not look away from him when she answered. "My aunt," she said. "She worked in the city. She told me years ago," she said, "if you ever find yourself at the Varon estate and you need someone, there is a number. She said you would not make it a condition." A brief pause. "She died in November. I took the position in March. I thought," she stopped, started again more simply. "I thought she was right about you." The kitchen was very quiet. Mrs. Forres, who had stood in that kitchen for 28 years and witnessed a great deal of what passed between people under pressure and in grace, watched Cale Varon's face do the thing she had just said it had never done. It was not dramatic. It was, in fact, nearly invisible, a slight loosening around the jaw, a settling of the shoulders by perhaps a quarter of an inch, the eyes going to some middle distance and returning. But she had watched him for a very long time, and she knew the difference between a man composing himself and a man being, briefly and without armor, composed by something outside himself. He looked at the card on the bench. He picked it up and turned it over in his hand once and set it back. "Keep it," he said. "Then, is there anything you need?" Not a question exactly. The way he said it, it was more like an opening, the kind a man makes when he has decided he will make it and is leaving the terms to her. Miriam considered this with the same unhurried patience she gave the pastry. Then she said, "I think I have what I need, but I'll tell you if that changes." He nodded once. He left the kitchen the way he had come in, through the door, no announcement, the room recalibrating behind him. Mrs. Forres heard from Mr. Thorne that afternoon, through the particular economy of estate communication that required nothing as obvious as a direct conversation, that a matter had been referred to the appropriate channels, that a man's access to certain information regarding a member of the Varan kitchen staff had been quietly and permanently revoked, and that there would be no further contact. She did not ask for details. She did not need them. She understood what had been done and how, through reach and influence and the weight of a name, off-page from the kitchen, and from anything she would ever be asked to describe. She went about her afternoon. The next morning, Miriam arrived at 5 as she always did. She started the ovens. She set out her knife roll. She began the first laminate of the day with the same patient, even hands, and when Petra came in at 5:30 with her hair still damp and her coat misbuttoned, Miriam poured her a cup of coffee and said something that made the girl laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind Petra had not managed all winter. At 7, Cale Varan appeared at the kitchen pass. He stood there for a moment in the way he had stood the second and third mornings, still, contained, saying nothing. Then his eyes found Miriam at her station, and whatever he saw there, the even hands, the quiet competence, the unhurried warmth with which she turned to speak to Petra, settled something in him that Mrs. Forres could read from across the room. He did not come in. He did not say anything. After a moment he left. Mrs. Aldine Forres stood at her station and looked at the kitchen she had run for 28 years. The copper pans, the stone flags, the high casement windows letting in the early March light. And she thought about what it meant that a man like that had come to a kitchen past 3 mornings in a row, and then come through the door on the 4th, and said 4 words and listened to 4 in return, and left looking like a man who had just been given something he had not known he was missing. She thought about an aunt in the city who had told a frightened niece, years before she needed it, that there was a number and a name, and that the name could be trusted. She thought about what it meant to give someone that, not safety in the dramatic sense, not rescue as a grand gesture, but a name and a number and the plain conviction that the man behind it would not make it a condition. She thought that the aunt had known something true about a man most people knew only by reputation, and that the niece had carried that knowledge through a hard winter and arrived at the right kitchen door in early March, and that neither of them had done anything requiring a word louder than the ones that had passed between them that morning. She went back to her work. At the end of the breakfast service, Miriam cleaned her station with the thoroughness she brought to everything, dried her hands, and looked up at Mrs. Forres across the kitchen. "He's a good man," she said, simply, not as a discovery, as a thing confirmed. Mrs. Forres looked at her for a moment, then she said, "Yes, he is." And that was all that needed to be said in that kitchen on that morning, with the March light coming through the high casements and the copper pans back on their hooks and Petra humming something quiet to herself at the bread station, and the estate settling into the ordinary business of a day that was, on the surface, unremarkable, and that Mrs. Aldine Forres would remember. She already knew she would remember it for the rest of her time at the Varan estate. The most feared man she had ever known had walked into a kitchen and left it, for the first time in 28 years, looking like a man who had been truly seen. And the woman who had done it had simply told him what her aunt had always known, that she already had his number, and that she had come here because she believed it. That was all, and it was everything,